Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. As usual, if you have any questions regarding this specific video or actually any video for that matter, feel free to leave them down in the comment section down below. Like I usually say, I try to get back to you guys as much as possible. And also, consider subscribing if you aren't already subscribed. I would greatly appreciate that. With that said, let's jump into it. So I think for today's video, I'll kind of make this a quick one since a few videos ago, I think we kind of covered the HTTP GET, POST, and PATCH for Apex REST web services. I think today I'll cover the HTTP delete. So, nothing crazy, just a quick video to get something out to you guys. But yeah, let's kind of jump into it. So, as you can see here, in my Visual Studio Code, I kind of already downloaded all the code regarding this apply web service. And I guess this is a good moment to mention a few things. This is kind of like a series at this point in which, we've covered, like I said, the HTTP GET, POST, and PATCH. And I think I even made a playlist series for it in case, you kind of want to go back and watch all of that. So I'm kind of just building off of those videos. So, if there's something I kind of skim over, it's probably because it's been covered in that past video. And I will try to do my best to cover everything as much as possible. It's just that I don't want to keep repeating myself. So if there's a question, either leave it down in the comment section below and I'll get back to you, or just go into that playlist series, which I'll link down as well, and go ahead and watch that. The other part is if you're not aware of how to get this set up on your local environment, I will link a video down in the description box below as well. But yeah, with that said, let's jump into it. So like I said, we've gone over how to create an HTTP GET, which allows us to basically call this endpoint and then retrieve a list of supplies, as well as we've done a POST, which allows us to call this endpoint to create a brand new supply record in our Salesforce org. And then lastly, which I think we did in the previous video or two ago, we created the HTTP patch, which allows us to receive a list of records with the IDs and some fields that we want to update in our Salesforce org. So yeah, just to kind of go into a little bit more, basically this method, if I go into the actual JSON wrapper as well, which we'll kind of get into a bit, essentially we're receiving a list of these things right here. And this is just like the Apex class representation of the JSON code itself. But essentially, if you can think of it, we receive a list of these supply objects, and as long as it has this record ID, which is like the unique identifier, then we match that up to a record that exists in Salesforce, and we allow updates to these different fields. So that was the patch. And I think for today, just to kind of get a quick video out there, we'll focus on the HTTP delete, which as the name might imply, it allows us to call this endpoint to delete a record that exists in our Salesforce org. So with that said, I think what I'm going to do just to kind of save time, we're going to kind of copy the code for the HTTP patch, and we'll kind of just like co-opt it a bit and make it work for, for the delete. So I'll copy and paste this in here, and the delete, it's going to have a lot of the same things. So we're going to expect to receive a JSON that's going to have, in this case, we really only care about, the record ID. We don't really care about anything else. So I think we can receive a JSON and then make it conform to this type of class object right here, or class instantiation object right here. And like I said, we really only care about this. So we could create a brand new class to represent our JSON object with just like this right here. It was just a record, but I think we can reuse this. It's fine, and I don't think it's that big of a deal. But it's something you might want to consider doing. So yeah, we're going to reuse this essentially. And just to kind of go over the code real quick, this is we just copied the HTTP patch, but essentially this method right here, we called it delete supplies. It returns back a supply JSON wrapper .response object, which is just a class instantiation of this right here. So basically, this is what the endpoint gets back as a response, and this this gets converted into a JSON message. So basically they'll have a key of success with a value of true or false because it's a Boolean, and a key of message, which is a string. So the message could be like, oh, successfully deleted the the record, or couldn't delete the record because you sent us a wrong record ID or something along those lines. So that'll be useful for us. We'll be able to build up this message, as we kind of go through our logic. So just to kind of start off, I set the success to false and the message to be a blank. And then these fields get updated, as we kind of progress through our code. So the next line is this line, which I think I mentioned now a few times. I don't really think this is necessary at all. I think I started doing this probably when I first started getting into like Salesforce development as like a means of being like super defensive. But if you look at it, it doesn't really make sense, right? Because like if we get a call to this method right here, well, then the request couldn't be null because in order to call this method, you have to do a request. But I don't really think it's hurting anything, so I kind of just leave it there. So just feel free to ignore it. And I don't even think the Salesforce docs use this as well. But okay, just ignoring that for a second. The next line, we're basically going to get the request body from the REST context request.request body object, and then we just convert that to a string. So there's a request body, and then from here we just check to make sure that that it's not blank. And then from there, if it's not blank, then we encapsulate everything we're going to do in a try catch, because we're going to be doing some JSON deserialization, which, if the JSON is malformed, it is technically possible for us to get, some type of exception. So we cover that in a try catch just to be a little bit safe. And again, as I always like to say, and I know I kind of say this probably way more than I should, none of this is production grade code. This is just, a demo or an example to get you guys, used to or comfortable, or as a refresher rather, about, HttpDelete in this case. None of this is meant to be used in production. In production, you would want to have a lot more checks in place and logic and all that good stuff. So with that said, inside of our try catch, here we are deserializing basically the payload we received by using the JSON.deserialize. We pass in that string request body, and we're telling the JSON deserializer that we want it to be deserialized using the class definition of the supply class that exists in the supply JSON wrapper. So again, if we jump into that real quick, it is essentially this. We're basically telling the JSON deserializer that we're going to receive a list of this object, or this class instance, which is an object. So hope that makes sense. Yeah, but like I said, here is the request body that we got from the request. That's just a string. Here is the class definition that we want to deserialize it into. Here, what's happening right here, when the JSON deserializes it deserializes it, I believe, as like a generic object, and we're basically typecasting it into this specific type of object, which is a list of supply. A list of supply JSON wrapper dot supply. So this is indicating that this is the class within this file. And what I'm doing here is I'm just basically storing that and calling it supply payload right here. And then in the next line right here, we have this method called update supply records, which we pass in the supply payload, and then it spits back out something else. So this is the part where we can kind of start making some changes. Instead of doing calling update supply records, we can say right here, delete supply records. And what we're going to do here, the delete supply records, the logic is going to be abstracted away, but the specific logic is basically finding those records that the request payload wants us to delete. And then once we do that, once we get the return of the delete supply records, if we actually found records to delete, which is right here, instead of doing an update, we'll do a delete like so. So we'll say delete. The success boolean will be set to true, and the message is currently supply request processed successfully. But we can say supply request processed successfully, and then we can say deleted records or something like that, just so we can kind of know exactly what happened. If we didn't find any records, then the success, it's basically stays as false, because that's kind of how it is up there. But anyways, I explicitly set it to false, and then the message is supply request not process. Verify that the required field or should be required fields are provided. But we'll say right here, verify that And in this case, we're using the record ID as the unique identifier. You might use something else like your external ID if you have, a connection to an external endpoint. But in this case, we're just using record ID to keep things simple. So we're going to say verify that the record IDs provided are valid, or contact the Salesforce admin for help. So I think that's makes enough sense, right? And you might notice here, basically said record IDs, so plural. Like I said, we should expect, or we can expect, to receive a list of those supply objects. So this code is, I guess you can call it modular in a sense, or extensive enough that it allows it to delete one record or many. It doesn't have to be one or many, so it doesn't really care. But okay, here we go. And then if for some reason we get some type of exception when we're going through this code, then the catch will handle it here. You'll notice here I just have a general exception. That's fine. I don't really, again, for demo purposes, I think this is fine. So general exception catch, basically catch any exceptions. The success flag is still set to false, and then the message will be supply request not processed and counter error. And then we just basically grab that error and then send it back to them. And then here, you'll see I have this to do comment right here, log error and object. And I think I mentioned this in probably one of the previous videos that it might be a good idea, if you have some type of like error logging object in your Salesforce org, that you could create, a record of this object type to basically store that, just to kind of keep a record of like things that are kind of like not working or breaking in your system. So you can kind of like go back and perhaps make it easier to debug as well. So it was more of a suggestion than anything else. That's why I put it as a to-do. But yeah, so I think this pretty much is the code that we need. I mean, aside from actually implementing the delete supply records, I think this code looks pretty solid. So we can kind of start working on the actual logic of delete supply records. Or actually, let's kind of continue down before we do that. So once all that's done running, we want to create the actual response, message back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to instantiate the supply JSON wrapper response class. And so that basically gets me an object, which I called response payload. If we look at the response class, it's just this right here. So we're basically, instantiating this class, which makes it an object, which we call it response payload. And then I'm basically populating those fields, the success and the message. And then we're just returning it right here. Well, when we return an object, as you see here, this is a return type right here. Salesforce is smart enough to know that, because we're dealing with an HttpDelete, and this is like a REST web service because, this is what we're working with. It's going to basically serialize our JSON for us. So, we'll use Postman in a second to kind of go through, this actual endpoint. We'll see that we'll receive back a response, which is a JSON, which in this case will contain, two key value pairs, one for success and one for message. So that's kind of how we accomplish that right here. But the main takeaway is that Salesforce, or at least the compiler or whatever it is smart enough to serialize it for us, so we don't have to do it ourselves. Okay, moving on from that, let's go ahead and actually make the delete supply records method. So we'll go ahead and minimize this method for us right here, and then let's go ahead and create a private static, and then the return type for this method will be a list of supplies, and we said it was going to be called delete supply records, and we should expect to receive, or in the parameters is this, so basically our supply payload right here. And in here I'm kind of going to cheat because we can kind of use some of the same code right here. And like I said, this is not, production grade code. A lot of the code that I'm writing, it's like not very dry. So, it's a lot of repeating. I'm sure you can abstract away a lot of the logic into their own methods. So you're not, rewriting a lot of the same code. But for now, for demonstration purposes, I think this is fine. So I'll copy the update supply records, and then we'll kind of, conform that to what we need it to be for the deletes. So copy and paste here. And to start with, we're creating a new list of supplies. We call it the supply record list. We're going to iterate through our supply payload, which is great. And we're basically saying here that, if the string is not blank, and that being the record ID, which is actually the thing that we care about most, then we're going to do something here. And here you'll see we have more to-dos. So in this case, we have add validation to record ID to ensure it matches a record in the system. And yes, this is actually very important because, in this case of the deletes, in order for us to actually delete a record in the system, that record actually has to exist in the system. So, you would want to make sure that, you can do that. The way you would do that is you would probably, or at least what I would do is you can probably like store all these record IDs into a list of strings, and then you do a SQL query after you're done with your for loop. And then, then you have, your list of supplies that you can then delete. And normally, like I would say, this is something that you can kind of do on your own. I just kind of want to do a very simple example. So, I would operate with the assumption, at least for this demo, that, this is already being done. But I think since this video is not that long, we'll actually do it ourselves. So, we can kind of see how that works. So what we're going to do here is on top of here, let's create a list of strings, and we'll call this supply record IDs. Create a new list of this string. Just instantiate a new list of strings like so. And in here, instead of doing all this stuff, I'm going to delete that. We'll delete this too. But essentially, we're doing the validation of that record ID ourselves. So if the payload, the JSON payload we're getting for that specific record that we want to delete is not blank, let's add it to our supply record IDs. So we'll just do an add like that. Then we're going to add the supply dot record ID like so. So what's going to happen is, here, let me format this a little bit better. We're going to go through our entire JSON essentially, and then we're going to go ahead and grab all the record IDs of that payload. Once that's done processing, then let's do our SQL query. So in this case, we don't really need this right here. What I'm going to go ahead and do is we'll just instantiate it right here. And instead of saying a new list, we're going to do a SQL query like so. And actually, yeah, that's fine. We'll do it this. So we'll do a select, and then we're going to do, we really only want the ID. So we'll do select ID from supply. So supply, and then we'll do where the ID is equal to something, and that thing being the supply records IDs. And actually it's not equals to, it's where ID is in this list. So I think that looks right. It's been a while since I've done this myself. I usually just use Google if I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure this is right. So yeah, we're gonna get all those supplies basically that the payload asked us for, and then we're going to return it. And actually, we don't even need to create, store this in a list. We can just kind of do this here. And I'm pretty sure we can just return it in line. I think you can do that just because we're kind of lazy. Okay, so no error messages. That looks good. But yeah, essentially, if, kind of going through it one more time, we created a delete supply records method to kind of abstract the logic away from our main HttpDelete method, which is always a good idea to kind of, separate the logic out. That's the single responsibility principle, I believe it's called. But anyways, so our delete supply records method receives the payload, which is those JSON objects or whatever. We're going to go through them, iterate through them using our for loop. And then we're going to just do a very simple check. Basically, if that record ID is not blank, and not blank means empty strings or null. If it's not that, then we're going to add it to this string of list that we have defined up here. And then at the end, we're in line doing a SQL query and returning it back to whatever called this method. So hope that makes sense. Like I said, feel free to leave a comment down below if it doesn't make sense, and I'll try my best to explain it better, I guess. So with that said, let's kind of close this up and let's go back to our HttpDelete for one more time. So basically here, call this method, the logic runs, and then we end up getting a list of supplies that we want to delete. Here we delete them, and I think we're actually good to go. So hopefully I didn't go too fast and it made sense to you guys. But now let's actually go ahead and try this out, see if it works. So I'll hit save, and I'm going to go ahead and deploy source to org. Hopefully there are no error messages. And it looks like we did get an error message, and it looks like variable does not exist, supply record on line 234. Let's see what that was. Variable does not exist. Oh, yep. My list is actually called supply record IDs, not supply record ID. That's why I got that error message. So let's try one more time. Deploy source to org. And looks like it ran successfully this time. So let's go ahead and jump into our org, and we'll go ahead and refresh this. And now to actually delete it, let's say, actually let's switch to a different list view. I'll just do an all. And let's say that we want to delete a few. So we'll delete Cantina band instruments, which is spelled wrong. And then we'll do name one. We'll do both name one. So basically these three are going to be deleted. In order to delete them, you'll see here I opened them up in their own tabs. That's because we want to grab this record ID right here. So I'll just have those kind of ready for us to go. Let's pull up our Postman. And now I have made videos in the past about how to use Postman, how to do the, the authentication and the callouts and all that good stuff. As of now, we're just using the username password flow, which I don't think is really recommended to do anymore. But it's the simplest one to get us going. So in the future, I'll make other authentication mechanism videos if you guys are interested. Feel free to let me know down below in the description and in the comment section down below. But anyways, for now, I'm going to just authenticate, and I have all my values abstracted away, so you guys can't get into my org or see my password. But anyways, so I authenticated. Here is the access token. And what we want to do now is I'm actually going to create another request in Postman. So I'm going to duplicate this one. And this one, we're going to call it, let's rename it. We'll do, oops, did not mean to do that. Let's delete this one. I want to rename. We're going to call this delete supply, which should be delete supplies because it's multiple, but that's fine. We'll just leave it at that. We're going to change the patch to a delete to let it know. That's basically how, it knows, because we're not actually, passing in like the HTTP method name, which is like delete supply records. It knows which method to call based on the verb that you're selecting. So, because we selected delete, it knows to use the delete method annotation in our Salesforce org, which is the delete supply records. So make sure we have the correct verb. Let's go into headers, and we'll change the authorization to be, let me go ahead and grab it one more time. So grab this right here, go into the header, which has I already have the key authorization and then the value correctly. I just need to update the actual string itself. So once I have that, let's go into the body, and you'll see here, we kind of already have most of the JSON done for us. We have a list of objects, and basically what I'm going to do is, we said we wanted to delete 3 records. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit, make sure we take away the comma because we don't need that. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this one more time like that. So we're going to have 3 records, and the IDs, let's go ahead and clean that up like that. And now let's go into our org. We're going to grab this one, which is the Cantina band instruments, which is spelled wrong. Paste that there. And then let's go back to our name one. Paste that as a second one. And then we'll go to our third name one, or third record we want to delete, which is also called name one. And we'll paste that right there. And actually, just to start off, let's do delete 2. And then we'll do like, another request, which is just delete 1 record, just to see that it's working for both scenarios. So kind of a moment of truth. Let's go ahead and send it off and see what happens. So we see here, we got back our response at the bottom. And we can look at the raw response, which is just, like I said, a JSON response back. If we prettify it, here's what it looks like. The success is true, and it's saying that the supply record processed successfully. It deleted records. So now if we go back into our org, and it was the first two, if we refresh, we'll see here, oh, it looks like there's a problem. It couldn't find it because we just deleted it. And again, this one right here, looks like it's been deleted. Okay, and the third one, it should still exist because we haven't actually deleted it. But now, let's go ahead and copy the ID, and let's go and update the record ID right here. And this time we'll just do a one deletion, essentially. Let's hit send, and same thing here. We got a response back. It didn't really look like it changed because, you know, it's the exact same message, but it looks like it worked. Let's go ahead and refresh it. And there we go. It's no longer in our org. It's actually been deleted successfully. So that's essentially how you can delete stuff. Now, there is other ways of deleting stuff. The way I showed you is, you know, we're really making use of Apex classes to represent our JSON objects, which I think is, you know, kind of a neat way of doing things. I think it's much more organized. But, you know, there's nothing to say that you can't do it a different way, right? Like, instead of sending sending in your JSON in the body, you could just, you know, pass, you know, a parameter in the URL, and that could be, you know, like your record ID as well. And I think that's actually what, if we go back to the trailhead for Apex Web Services, if we search for the delete one right here, you'll see here that they have this example, which is a very simple example. And what they're doing is, so, you know, they get the REST request, and then they create a string called case ID. So this is the record ID for a case, I believe. And they're grabbing the case ID from the actual URL. So, you know, you see here request URI, substring, and they're basically grabbing something after the / one thing after the / and essentially, like, if we go back into our thing right here, what that kind of looks like as an example. So, you know, we'll say like this is HTTPS HTTPS, and then we'll do like your, you know, Salesforce org.com, if, you know, just pretend that it's your org right here. And, you know, then we'll do like your Apex class or whatever. Normally, you know, if you wanted to pass in a parameter in your URL, you would use the little question mark to denote parameters. And then you would say something like, in that case, it was like case ID equals like, you know, some string of numbers, right? You could do it this way too. And that would totally work. Essentially what that piece of code is doing, which I'll pull up right here, it's going to the last index of where this / happens. So, you know, right here, essentially, or actually, sorry, it would be like this, like right here. And then saying go one after that, which that would be this right here, I believe. So essentially it would grab this right here. So, you know, that would allow you to get the ID. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. It's been a while since I've done it this way. I usually prefer, you know, especially if you're doing, like, in my opinion, if you're doing like a bigger integration project with, you know, some other endpoint, I think it makes more sense to, you know, when you're doing Apex REST web services, to do it this way. Kind of similar to, you know, when you're doing SOAP, you also do classes to represent, like, you know, the XML or whatever it be. So that's just my experience. You know, orgs are very different. There's a lot of developers out there. If you are way more experienced than I am, you know, feel free to leave your experience down below in the comment section below. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers it for today. Hope you guys found this video useful, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.